all around me, a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. In the shadow of a steeple, I saw my people. By the relief office, I seen my people. As I stood there hungry, I stood there asking, is this land made for you and me? This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island. From the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me.
Yeah. It's been strange to drive around Tulsa recently and see the murals of Woody Guthrie with his signature slogan taped to his guitar. This machine kills fascists. When fascism seems so alive and well, like the most boring zombie movie you've ever seen. Thanks, Barbara. It landed back here. Coffee's in the Day Alliance room, everybody. Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil. And I've been realizing that more and more lately. It's the same playbook over and over again, bringing us back to a place we've already been. And just unlike the machine of music that's supposed to end fascism, our resistance to tyranny is a lot less glamorous and requires more of us than any slogan could capture. It's not been until recently that I've come to intimately realize that this machine kills fascism in a way that even in my most empathetic moments, my most ministerial moments, I could hardly have imagined. This challenges us to make decisions, to reassess codes of conduct, ethical lines once thought definitive, to love creatively, not boringly, to search inside ourselves and ask, what might we do to protect and preserve those in our care and our spiritual values all at the same time? And we're feeling the burn of that now. I'm willing to bet that nearly every person in this room, if you haven't already in a short while, will have to ask yourselves when it comes down to it, what will you do? When the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe was officially made a few weeks ago, I heard many talking about how this was the first time that the highest court in the land had actually taken a right away from the American people. And if you look at it from a strictly constitutional or legislative point of view, from a point of view tied not to our aspiration of universal human rights, but to legalese, then that's correct. But if we look at American history with our spirits, our better angels, our creative love, then we must look to 1857, to the Dred Scott decision. In that case, as most of you probably know, a black man who was enslaved crossed state lines to a state in which he was legally free, and then sued his enslavers for his freedom. The case wound its way up to the Supreme Court, and in a 7-2 decision, Dred Scott was denied his freedom, creating precedent that American citizenship and rights conferred in the Constitution did not apply to peoples of African descent, whether born free or not. And in the controversial decision, perhaps the worst the court ever delivered, Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote the infamous line that they, meaning black peoples, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And so in his words, quote, might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for their benefit. As if it were an incidental inclination to respect someone's humanity and life, instead of a sacred ethical imperative that binds us together in respectful siblinghood. Only fascism could take a covenant and make it a cliff note. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. And one might say the same these days for the reproductive rights of childbearing peoples in America. The vote by an Oklahoma senator this week restricting women's freedoms across state lines certainly strikes a familiar tone. The all but certain restriction of anyone who dares live openly into their sexuality or gender in states rushing to strip away their right to privacy certainly strikes a sadly familiar tone. The Dred Scott decision, unpopular even in its day, all but ensured that slavery would not come to an end via peaceful legislative means. The decision dictated that Black American citizenship would not be won at the ballot box, but would be wrestled away from tyrannical, fascist minority rule via bullets. No more than 2.5 years later, after a contested election, countless incidents of domestic terror, the Civil War broke out. And if I may speak to you candidly, not without hope, but also with stark realism, I say to you honestly that I fear with this new decision recently made in the social and political climate of fascistic minority rule we now face, with the chronic American amnesia of the 24-hour news cycle, with loss of faith in our institutions and a lack of courage and compassion in so many of our civic interactions, I fear we may be headed to another. I don't wish this upon us. I pray daily that we avoid it. But I also have to prepare my spirit for that possibility. And I think we all should. Not just for our ability to remain agile and resilient, but for our families and communities too. Because in these terrifying and uncertain times, in order to live honestly into our values, we have to not just have something to believe in, but some ones too. We have to have heroes. And thankfully, as Unitarian Universalists, we're flush with them. People like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Unitarian minister in Massachusetts, contemporary of Theodore Parker and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Higginson was a lover of poetry, and for a time exchanged letters with the young Emily Dickinson, celebrating and encouraging her writing when almost no one else did. He was a fierce advocate for women's rights, working for women's suffrage almost a century before it became a reality. And he was also, before 1860 at least, an anti-war activist, protesting the Mexican-American War, rallying for pacifism. He was the quintessential Unitarian. But the times around him became more turbulent. The fight came closer to home. And his values called him into a new way of living. His creative love changed him. After an altercation with armed slave catchers attempting to forcibly extradite a free black man from Boston down to the southern states, Higginson was wounded, nearly killed. They slashed for his throat, missed, scarred his face for the rest of his life. But in that moment, he stared eye to eye, not just with people with an ideological distance, difference of legislative opinion, but he stared at the banality of evil. And it changed him. and his activism went from theory to practice. He supported the effort to create a stronghold of abolitionism in Kansas, including financial support for Ephraim Newt, another Unitarian minister from Boston who risked life and limb to keep his Lawrence, Kansas congregation alive. Newt's church was burned to the ground by pro-slavery militias. His brother was murdered by pro-slavery terrorists. But he stood steadfast against slaveholding fascists in Kansas and Missouri. And he could always count on the support of Higginson because he knew that the fight had to be waged. And Higginson supported allies beyond his own religious community. He was one of 4 Unitarian ministers who made up the Secret Six, supplying financing and arms for John Brown, the Calvinist militant abolitionist who attempted to start a multi-state slave revolt in 1859. Some people call him crazy. I don't think he was. They'll call a white man crazy for being willing to die and kill for the freedom of black people. That doesn't seem right. Seems like the banality of evil. When the Civil War finally broke out, Higginson, once a fervent pacifist, commissioned into the Union Army, leading one of the first regiments of freed black men. Higginson was willing to fight, to die, to kill even, for his values. But one need not necessarily choose combat or reciprocal violence in order to stay true to their spiritual convictions in the face of fascism. A little less than a century after Higginson came another couple of heroes. This time, fascism was raging not just in the American South, but globally as well. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, upending a liberal age. And America, in the grip of the Depression, was slow to respond, especially when it came to accepting refugees fleeing the genocidal circumstances created by Nazi conquest of Eastern Europe. The United States even turned away from our shores the SS St. Louis, better known as the infamous Voyage of the Damned. And it was then that the Unitarian Service Committee recruited Minister Waitstill Sharp and his wife Martha. Martha was a highly educated woman in her day, but nonetheless kept a relatively traditional role of stay-at-home mother. But Waitstill and Martha agreed to go abroad to Czechoslovakia and join an underground resistance led by Unitarian theologian Norbert Capek. Martha at first left her and Waitstill's children quite reluctantly. Upon arrival in this treacherous foreign land, she was incredibly homesick and almost certain that her and her husband had made a terrible mistake. She missed her kids. She missed the safe life they'd built, but the courage she saw in the faces of those with whom she was entrusted to assist transformed her. She described the circumstances of organizing a transport plane of Jewish youth being smuggled out of Prague by their parents, who stayed behind to an almost certain death. Quote, "The parents' self-control was marvelous. Smiling brightly, eyes brimming with tears, they waved at the children. The door of the plane was slammed shut with a finality that rocked the little group. And suddenly we were all one large and bereft family." Waitstill would return to the US shortly thereafter to fundraise and rally support. But Martha stayed in occupied Europe, continuing to smuggle dissidents and children out for the remainder of the war, missing her own kids' birthdays and milestones, risking her life even when her friends, like Norbert Capek himself, met tragic and horrific fates. But Martha's creative love blurred lines that were once so stark for her in order to remain true to her convictions. Around this same time, James Luther Adams, one of Unitarian Universalism's most revered 20th century voices, actually spent time in Germany during the rise of the Third Reich. He experienced firsthand the real-time slide from the liberal Weimar Republic era, which contributed to the world stage some of the most incredibly progressive and visionary art, architecture, music, and culture of the entire 20th century. Berlin was where it was at. And it slid into a brutal, extremist minority rule that even at its peak only represented 1/3 of the German body politic. 1/3. Adams hadn't realized how quickly the landscape shifted underneath him. And he was nearly arrested, which would have meant death, for openly critiquing the Nazi regime. Adams said of this time, freedom of association was being abolished. You keep your mouth shut and you conform, or you get your head bashed in. At this juncture, I had to confront a rather embarrassing question. I had to ask myself, what in your typical behavior as an American citizen have you done that would help prevent the rise of authoritarian government in your own country? And decades after the Second World War, Adams had to answer that question again. The increasing intensity of Christian fundamentalists' use of violence and intimidation to achieve their political and legislative ambitions was becoming evident. Abortion clinics were being bombed, women's healthcare providers assassinated. The marriage of Christian fundamentalism with Confederate Nazism was becoming clear. And Adams warned his seminary students about this. He told them as far back as 1982, when you're my age, you will all be fighting Christian fascists. And these last couple decades, sadly, have proved him right. We've experienced countless acts of domestic terror, both large and small. From the Oklahoma City bombing to Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist congregation shooting, from the Emmanuel Church shooting to January 6th. We're approaching a time when we may need to choose our faith and our principles or our lives, livelihood, and personal safety. Because only once in a century or so do societies face such existential crises. And being spiritually resilient and emotionally adaptable is crucial to survive such occurrences. Being creative instead of boring. Many of us Unitarian Universalists, when living into our daily aspiration of universal salvation, however you define that, when in our quest to remain with our hearts ever open and our arms ever outstretched, bridges ever being built, we often deny or diminish or compartmentalize the reality of evil, greed, authoritarianism, and brutality that lie at the heart of fascist power structures. Many of us simply can't process such a framework because it's so antithetical to our sacred value set. But that's why we need to look back into our tradition and seek out the wisdom of UUs who have come before us and confronted the full reality of evil, stared it in the face, been targeted by it, resisted it, sometimes lived to tell the tale. We need to be grounded in the stories of our traditions past so we can learn from our ancestors' triumphs and mistakes. We need to be grounded in the love and community that sustains us so that we remember the humanity, remember the laughs, remember the look in the eye when we held close the people for whom we will fight and defend. Remember the creativity of love. Courage so rarely comes as naturally to us as compassion. Courage takes a bit more practice and preparation. We don't actually know how we will react in times of terror or trial until we are in them. But when we prepare ourselves spiritually for the possibility of that cold darkness, we are better able to maintain our hopeful flame of bright and warm light. I want you to do me a favor when you leave here today. This is my most Reverend Marlin thing that I'm ever going to do. I ask you to do something when you go home. I want you to do me a favor when you leave here today. Think about the heroes that you hold dear to your heart. Maybe they're household names. Maybe they're just known to a fortunate local few. Maybe they're theologians. Maybe they're doctors. Maybe they're long dead. Maybe they're young and vibrant. But they're the people you think about when your spirit is faced with that terrible dilemma. What do I do? How do I protect myself and my loved ones and preserve my spiritual values at the same time? I want you to find your heroes and print out a picture of them. Print out a bunch of pictures of them, all of them, and put them around where you can see them. Be reminded of them, deliberate on them. On the fridge, in the visor, on your car, on the bathroom mirror, over the fireplace, above the coffee maker. Hang them up like the way there used to be the framed photos of Lincoln and JFK and FDR and Martin Luther King in your grandparents' house, like the commemorative plates that you used to be able to order off TV. Hang them up like that. And do your best to continue to learn about your heroes. Learn especially about their flaws. When were they too hot-headed and stubborn? When were they too quick to make sacrifices when they could have pushed harder? When were they too slow? And what damage was wrought from their ego or idealism? And then forgive your heroes, because they're human just like you and me. And most of all, forgive your enemies. Not just because that's what divine humanity requires of us, but because it's creative. That's how we live in beloved community that we're fighting so hard for. And that's what'll save us too. These are tough times. And they are times that will be written about and reflected upon for ages to come. We will be the guiding light for the generations that come after us, and who will be determined to maintain the freedoms and the community and the love that we struggle to ensure for them. And even if we fail more often than we succeed, if we do it with spiritual conviction, with compassionate deliberation, and with creative love, respect for each other, respect for our enemies, and an unflinching hope for our loved ones over and above any fear of legislative or judicial consequence, then maybe each and every one of us can be heroes too, just for one day.
Wish you could swim like the dolphins. Dolphins can swim. Though nothing keep us together. We can be friends forever and ever. Just one day. I will be king, and you will be queen. and we can, though nothing can fall,
Nothing could fall.
and the shame is on the other side. Oh, we can beat them forever and ever. And we can be heroes just for one day. We can be heroes. We can be heroes. We can be heroes just for one day. We can be heroes just for one day.